They say some moments haunt you forever. Not just in the quiet hours of the night when your mind won't shut off, but in the middle of the day, when you're sipping coffee, driving to work, or folding laundry. A single thought, a single memory, and suddenly, it's like you're back there again, reliving it, feeling it, drowning in it. It's been 2 years since the day, 2 years since everything changed. And no matter how much time passes, no matter how many times I tell myself I've moved on, there's still this ache in my chest. A weight I can't shake. Because some mistakes, some betrayals, they don't just go away. They carve themselves into you, leaving scars you can't see but feel every single day. Looking back, I should have seen the signs. They were right in front of me. The distance. The silence. The slow unraveling of something I once thought was unbreakable. It didn't happen all at once, it never does. It's always gradual, like a slow leak in a sinking boat. At first, you don't even notice it. And by the time you do, it's already too late. I remember the moment I realized I wasn't happy. Not the kind of realization that hits you like a slap to the face, but the kind that creeps in so slowly you almost don't notice. Like waking up one day and realizing you don't recognize your own life. I would lie next to my husband at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of his breathing and wondering when we had become strangers. When had the laughter stopped? When had the conversations turned into nothing but routine exchanges about bills and schedules? I told myself it was normal. That this is what happens in marriage. The honeymoon phase fades, real life takes over, and love turns into something quieter. Something stable. But deep down, I knew better. Love isn't supposed to feel like loneliness. Love isn't supposed to make you feel invisible. But I felt it. Every single day. And then, he came along. At first, it was nothing. Just a casual friendship, harmless conversations, stolen moments that seemed innocent enough. But looking back, I see it so clearly now, how easily the lines blurred, how effortlessly I stepped closer and closer to the edge without even realizing it. Because that's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't always start with some grand, reckless decision. Sometimes, it starts with something as small as a smile, a lingering touch, a moment where, for the first time in a long time, you feel seen. I should have stopped it. But I didn't. And that's why I'm here now, telling this story. Because regret isn't just something you feel, it's something you carry. Every day. Every hour. Every minute. And maybe, just maybe, if I had known then what I know now, I would have made a different choice. If you love true stories of shocking infidelity, subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Cases for more real-life betrayals that will leave you speechless. And tell me in the comments, have you ever felt a love that turned into regret? I've been married for 8 years. 8 years of shared routines, morning coffees, laundry days, and quiet nights in front of the TV. 8 years of knowing exactly how he takes his eggs, which side of the bed he prefers, and the way he rubs his temples when he's stressed. 8 years of habits, traditions, and predictability. And yet, somewhere along the way, we stopped seeing each other. At first, it was just small things. Conversations that felt more like exchanges of information than moments of connection. Did you pay the electric bill? What time are you picking up the groceries? Don't forget the meeting with the contractor on Thursday. The kind of conversations you'd have with a roommate. A business partner. Not a lover. I'd reach for him at night, and he'd shift away, too tired, too preoccupied. I'd sit across from him at the dinner table, watching him scroll through his phone, nodding absently at whatever I was saying, barely even hearing me. And the worst part? I got used to it. I told myself this was normal. That marriage isn't all passion and excitement. That real love is steady, quiet, comfortable. And maybe that's true. But what happens when comfortable starts to feel like lonely? Because that's what it was, loneliness. Not just the kind where you're physically alone, but the kind where you're lying next to someone, sharing a life with them, and yet, you feel like you don't exist. I tried to bring it up once. One night, as we lay in bed, our backs to each other, I whispered, "Do you ever feel like we're just going through the motions?" He sighed, turned over, and looked at me. "What do you mean?" I hesitated. "I don't know. Like, we're stuck. Like we don't really talk anymore." He exhaled, long and tired. It's just life, babe. Work, stress. It's a lot. Doesn't mean anything's wrong. And just like that, the conversation was over. Maybe he was right. Maybe this was just life. But why did it feel so empty? Then there was him. At first, he was just a friend. A familiar face I'd see at the gym, a coworker I'd chat with in passing, someone's spouse I had met at a barbecue once or twice. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't someone I looked at that way. Not at first. But life has a funny way of sneaking up on you. The first time I really noticed him was on one of those ordinary, forgettable afternoons. My husband had come home from work, barely acknowledging me, his mind elsewhere. I had asked about his day, and he had answered in one-word responses, distracted and uninterested. So I went to the store, needing an excuse to get out of the house. That's where I ran into him. He smiled when he saw me. Actually smiled. Not the forced, polite kind, but the kind that feels warm. Genuine. The kind that makes you feel seen. "Hey," he said, his voice easy, familiar. "Long day?" I laughed, shaking my head. "You have no idea." We stood there, between aisles of cereal boxes and canned goods, just talking. About nothing, about everything. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was listening. It wasn't flirting. It wasn't inappropriate. But it was something. A tiny spark in a life that had started to feel cold. And once you notice the cold, it's hard to ignore it. After that, I started seeing him more often. At the gym. At the coffee shop. Random run-ins that didn't feel so random anymore. And every time, the conversations got a little longer. The smiles lingered a little more. I told myself it was innocent. That I was just enjoying the company, the attention. But deep down, I knew better. Because when your heart starts beating faster at the sound of someone's voice, when you find yourself checking your reflection before you run into them, when their name pops up on your phone and you feel a thrill instead of indifference. You know. You always know. And yet, I didn't stop. I told myself I could handle it. That I was in control. That this was just a friendship, nothing more. But looking back, I see it so clearly now. The way he looked at me just a little too long. The way I laughed just a little too easily around him. The way my husband barely noticed the way I had started dressing differently. The way I started staying out just a little later. There was a moment, one that still lingers in my mind. A small, fleeting thing, but God, it was everything. I was sitting across from him at a cafe, stirring my coffee, watching the way he traced patterns on the table with his fingers. He was telling a story, something funny, something light. But I wasn't really listening. I was just watching him. And then he looked up. Our eyes met. And I swear, just for a second, everything else faded. The cafe, the noise, the world. It was just us. And in that moment, I knew. I was in trouble. It happened on a night that was supposed to be ordinary. Just another dinner, another gathering, another evening of polite smiles and conversations that skimmed the surface of real connection. My husband and I had been invited to a small get-together, nothing extravagant, just a few close friends, some neighbors, the usual crowd. I almost didn't go. I had been tired. Drained. Another night of playing the part of the devoted wife, of standing next to him and pretending that everything was fine when, deep down, I felt invisible. But something in me, maybe boredom, maybe restlessness, pushed me to get dressed, fix my hair, put on a dress that I hadn't worn in a long time. A dress that made me feel something I hadn't felt in a while. Beautiful. Seen. My husband barely noticed. He glanced up from his phone, nodded absent-mindedly. "You look nice," he muttered before returning to whatever was on his screen. No smile. No real appreciation. Just another empty compliment, given out of obligation. But when I arrived at the party, he noticed. I felt his eyes on me before I even saw him. A slow, measured glance that sent a warmth creeping up my neck. When I finally turned and met his gaze, there was something there, something unreadable, something dangerous. "Wow," he said softly, just for me to hear. "You look incredible." And just like that, something shifted. The air between us felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. A tension I had ignored, pretended wasn't real, but in that moment, under the soft glow of the patio lights, the distant hum of laughter and conversation around us, I felt it. The night went on like any other, but suddenly, everything felt different. I was aware of him in a way I hadn't been before. The way he moved through the room. The sound of his laughter. The occasional glance that lingered just a second too long. And then, the moment that changed everything. I was in the kitchen, refilling my drink, when I felt someone step behind me. Close. Too close. "I don't think I've ever seen you in red before." His voice was low, smooth, just beside my ear. A shiver ran down my spine, and I hated how my body reacted, how my breath caught in my throat. I turned, forcing a small smile. "I don't wear it often." "You should." It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. The quiet certainty. The way his eyes moved over me, slow, deliberate. I should have walked away. I should have. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, holding his gaze, the weight of something unspoken pressing between us. Then, the brush of fingers against my wrist, so subtle, so fleeting, it could have been an accident. But it wasn't. And I knew it. My pulse quickened. I swallowed hard, my mind screaming at me to step back, to break the moment before it became something more. But I didn't move. Neither did he. And then, a voice. "Hey, babe, you ready to go?" My husband's voice. I startled, the world snapping back into focus. The kitchen. The laughter from the other room. The sound of my husband's footsteps approaching. I stepped away so fast, it felt unnatural. "Yeah," I said quickly, my voice slightly off, my hands trembling as I reached for my glass. When I glanced back at him, his expression hadn't changed. He was still watching me. Calm. Knowing. Like he felt what had just happened. Like he knew that something had shifted between us. And the worst part? So did I. I barely slept that night. Lying next to my husband in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, I kept replaying the moment in the kitchen. The heat of his touch, the way his voice had curled around me like a whisper meant for only us. The way my body had responded before my mind could catch up. I should have felt nothing. But I did. Guilt clawed at the edges of my mind, but I pushed it away. Nothing happened. It was a glance. A touch. A moment. That's all. And yet, it didn't feel small. I turned onto my side, watching the back of my husband's head. I thought about how distant he had felt lately, how many nights had passed with silence stretching between us, each of us lost in our own worlds. Had he noticed how unhappy I was? How lonely? Or had we drifted so far apart that he just didn't care? I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to sleep. But my body still hummed with something unshakable. Not just from him, but from what he had awakened in me. A hunger I hadn't realized was still there. A longing I had convinced myself was dead, and that terrified me. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing. People flirt all the time. It doesn't mean anything. It's harmless. I went about my routine, coffee, emails, laundry, trying to convince myself that last night was just a fleeting moment, a mistake of circumstance, a trick of my own loneliness. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped, expecting it to be him, even though there was no reason for him to text me. And when it wasn't him, I felt disappointed. Disappointed. I hated myself for that. I hated how alive I had felt in those few stolen seconds with him, how something inside me had woken up after lying dormant for so long. But wasn't that normal? Didn't everyone want to feel something? It wasn't about him, I told myself. It was about what he represented. A reminder that I was still wanted. Still seen. Still desirable. Because my husband, God, I couldn't even remember the last time he had touched me with want. I told myself it wasn't my fault. I had tried. I had reached for him, started conversations, asked for date nights. But he was always tired. Always busy. Always too distracted to notice me wilting right in front of him. So was it really so wrong to enjoy a little attention? A little harmless attention? I kept telling myself I wouldn't see him again, that I would keep my distance. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. Because when something makes you feel good, when something fills an empty space inside you, how do you walk away from that? I didn't reach out to him. I didn't have to. Because 2 days later, I ran into him again. It was at the grocery store, just like before. A chance meeting. At least, that's what I told myself. Hey, he said, his eyes lighting up when he saw me. Twice in 1 week. Must be fate. I laughed, but it was nervous, my heart thudding in my chest. More like bad timing. Or perfect timing, he countered. And then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, I asked, do you ever feel? I don't know, stuck. I regretted the words the second they left my mouth. Because they weren't just a question. They were an admission. He studied me for a moment, something shifting in his expression. Then he nodded, just once. Yeah, he said quietly. I do. Silence stretched between us. Not awkward, not tense. Just charged. And in that moment, I knew he understood. I wasn't alone in this feeling, in this longing, and somehow that made it all the more dangerous. I should have walked away that day. Right there in the grocery store, with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the scent of freshly baked bread in the air, I should have made my excuses and left. I should have laughed off his words, ignored the way they settled into my bones, ignored the way I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. But I didn't. I stood there, holding his gaze, feeling something crack open inside me. That conversation, the one that should have been a fleeting moment, changed everything. Because after that, we kept running into each other. At first, it was innocent. Coincidental. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The gym, the coffee shop, even a gas station one evening when I was filling up my car. Each time, we'd lingered just a little longer, the conversation stretching past what was appropriate, past what could be considered harmless. Then the texts started. At first, they were casual. A joke about something we'd talked about. A funny meme. Hope you're having a good day. And each time my phone buzzed, I felt that same thrill, the quickened heartbeat, the rush of something I couldn't quite name. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong. But I responded anyway. Because in those messages, in those brief moments of stolen attention, I felt like me again. Not a wife. Not just a mother. Not someone who blended into the background of their own life. Just me. I started looking for reasons to see him. An extra trip to the store. A detour on my way home, knowing he might be at the coffee shop he always went to in the mornings. And he started doing the same. One afternoon, I was leaving the gym, exhausted and sweaty, when my phone buzzed. Him. Still there? I hesitated for half a second before replying. Yeah, just finished. Wait for me. A sharp pang of guilt twisted in my stomach. I should say no. I should go home. Instead, I typed back, okay. I told myself it was just a few minutes. Just two friends talking. But when he walked through the doors, his eyes found mine instantly, and I felt my breath hitch. He smiled. Thanks for waiting. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. We walked to my car together, the air thick with something unspoken. And then, just before I could open the door, he reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face. It was innocent. Barely a touch. But my entire body went still. He let his fingers linger for just a second too long, his gaze locked onto mine, as if waiting. Testing. I swallowed hard. My pulse was racing, hammering in my ears. And then I did the only thing I could, I stepped back. I should go, I whispered. His hand dropped. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Yeah, me too. I got into my car and drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. But the worst part? I didn't regret it. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my husband snoring softly beside me. I thought about the way he had looked at me, the way my skin had burned under his touch. I had almost let something happen today. And instead of feeling relieved that I stopped it, all I could think about was how badly I wanted it. The next morning, I told myself I'd cut it off, that I'd stop responding, that I wouldn't see him anymore. But my resolve didn't even last a full day. Because that afternoon, my phone buzzed. Thinking about you. 2 simple words. But they shattered everything. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I shouldn't respond. I should not respond. But my fingers moved before my brain could catch up. Me too. And just like that, the dam broke. The messages became more frequent, more personal. It wasn't just small talk anymore. It wasn't just jokes or harmless comments. It was real. He told me things he had never told anyone. I told him secrets I hadn't even admitted to myself. We started making excuses to see each other. Not full-on dates, nothing that obvious. Just opportunities. A morning coffee here, a quick lunch there. And every time, the tension grew thicker, the air more charged. The line between what we were and what we were becoming blurred more and more. Until there was no line anymore. The moment I should have stopped everything, the moment I should have slammed the brakes before it was too late, came on a random Thursday afternoon. I was at the coffee shop. The same one where we always accidentally ran into each other. But this time, it wasn't an accident. This time, we had planned it. He was already sitting at a corner table when I walked in. His eyes lit up the moment he saw me. I shouldn't have gone. But I did. I slid into the chair across from him, my hands shaking slightly as I reached for my coffee. God, he said, shaking his head with a small smile. I missed you. A lump formed in my throat. I looked down, suddenly unable to meet his gaze. This was wrong. This was so wrong. And then, a voice. Hey, I didn't know you came here. I froze. My heart stopped. I turned slowly, my stomach twisting into knots. It was my husband's coworker. Someone who had been to our house. Someone who knew us. I forced a smile. Oh, hey. Yeah, I stop by here sometimes. He glanced between me and him, his brow slightly furrowed, as if trying to place the situation. As if something felt off. Panic surged through me. My face felt hot, my pulse hammering in my ears. But then he shrugged. Nice seeing you, he said, giving a polite nod before walking toward the counter. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. When I turned back to him, his jaw was clenched. That was close, he murmured. I nodded, swallowing hard. Too close. And yet, as I sat there, my hands still trembling from the rush of panic, I realized something horrifying. Even that close call, even almost getting caught, wasn't enough to make me stop. I wasn't walking away from this. I couldn't. That near miss should have been my wake-up call. It should have been the moment I put an end to everything before it spiraled completely out of control. But instead, it only made me reckless. Because something had shifted. I had spent so long convincing myself this was just innocent, that I wasn't doing anything wrong, but deep down, I knew better. I knew the moment I started hiding my phone. I knew the moment I started making excuses to leave the house at odd hours, rehearsing alibis in my head just in case. I knew the moment I started dressing differently, fixing my hair a little more, choosing perfume a little more carefully, feeling that electric rush whenever I knew I'd see him. I wasn't just walking toward the edge anymore. I was running. And that's how I found myself standing in front of a hotel room door late one evening, my hands trembling, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the entire hallway could hear it. It had started with a message. A single line that should have sent me running in the opposite direction. I need to see you. Alone. I had stared at those words on my screen, my breath shallow, my hands cold. Everything inside me had screamed, don't do this. But I had already typed my reply before my conscience could catch up. Tell me where. And now, here I was, standing outside room 214 of a dimly lit hotel, my entire body vibrating with anticipation and fear. I hesitated for half a second longer. One last moment to turn around. To walk away before it was too late. But then, as if sensing my presence, the door opened. And there he was. His eyes swept over me, dark and unreadable, his expression a mix of relief and something deeper. Something hungrier. Come inside, he murmured. I didn't move. Because I knew this was the moment. The moment I would cross a line I could never uncross. The moment I would become something I had never thought I could be. A cheater. I should have said no. I should have turned and left. Let this be the moment I saved myself. But instead, I stepped forward. And as soon as the door clicked shut behind me, he was there, so close I could feel the heat radiating off him. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to, because we both knew exactly why we were here. He reached out slowly, his fingers grazing my jawline, tilting my face up toward his. A silent question. A final chance to stop this. I didn't. I couldn't. And then his lips were on mine. The kiss wasn't soft. It wasn't gentle. It was urgent, desperate, years of longing and loneliness pouring into a single moment. I felt his hands gripping my waist, pulling me closer, and instead of resisting, I melted into him. And suddenly, all the guilt, all the fear, all the rationalizations didn't matter anymore. Because I wasn't thinking about my husband. I wasn't thinking about my marriage. I was thinking about this. About the way his hands felt on my skin. About the way my body responded to his touch, waking up in ways I had almost forgotten were possible. About the way my heart was racing, not with fear, but with something intoxicating. And then, we fell. There was no more hesitation. No more restraint. It happened in a blur of tangled sheets and whispered names, of hands exploring forbidden places, of breathless gasps and reckless surrender. A full betrayal. Complete. Irreversible. And when it was over, when we lay there in the aftermath, our bodies tangled, our breathing uneven, I waited for the guilt to consume me. I waited for the crushing weight of regret, for the panic to set in. But it didn't. Instead, all I felt was alive. I was still lying there, tangled in his arms, when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I stiffened instantly, my pulse spiking. I reached for it with shaky hands, my stomach twisting as I saw the name on the screen. My husband. A rush of cold panic shot through me. I hesitated for half a second before answering, forcing my voice to sound normal. Hey. Silence on the other end. Then, a single question. Flat. Cold. Where are you? My breath hitched. I opened my mouth, scrambling for an excuse, an alibi, anything, but before I could speak, he said something that made my entire world collapse in on itself. Something that turned my blood to ice. Don't lie to me. I know everything. The air in the room felt different. Thick. Stifling. I could still feel the warmth of his body beside me, hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, but my mind was miles away, trapped in the sound of my husband's voice echoing through my phone. I know everything. 2 words. 2 words that sent my world crumbling. I had spent months walking a dangerous tightrope, convincing myself I was careful, that I was in control, that no one would ever know. But I was wrong. And now, it was too late. I left before the sun even rose. Slipping out of the tangled sheets, I gathered my clothes in silence, my hands shaking as I dressed. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. Because the reality of what I had done was hitting me all at once, pressing down on my chest like a heavy stone. The scent of him was still on my skin. The taste of him still lingered on my lips. And yet, as I stood there staring at my own reflection in the hotel mirror, all I saw was a stranger. A woman I didn't recognize. A woman who had just shattered everything she had spent years building. I forced myself to breathe. You just need to get home. You just need to act normal. Normal. Like I hadn't just betrayed my husband in the worst possible way. Like I hadn't just set fire to my own life. The drive home felt endless. Every red light, every passing car, every face I glimpsed on the sidewalk felt like judgment. Like they all knew. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my hands were clammy against the steering wheel. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I sat there, trying to compose myself, trying to prepare. Because I had no idea what was waiting for me on the other side of that front door. I stepped inside quietly, the house unnervingly still. And then I saw him, my husband, sitting at the kitchen table, waiting. His expression was unreadable. His hands were clasped together, his jaw tight. But his eyes, there was something in his eyes that made my stomach drop. He knew. I opened my mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but my voice caught in my throat. Because I could feel it. The shift. The way the walls of my carefully constructed lies were closing in on me. I forced myself to move, to step toward him like nothing was wrong. If you act normal, maybe he'll believe you. But then, where were you? The question was sharp, cutting through the thick silence. My breath hitched. My mind scrambled for an excuse, an explanation, but I could feel the weight of his gaze on me. Watching. Waiting. I turned away, pretending to check my phone, pretending like his words hadn't rattled me to my core. Work ran late, I lied. I was exhausted, so I stayed with a friend. The lie tasted bitter. And for the first time, I realized how easily it rolled off my tongue. How used to this I had become. His eyes stayed locked on mine, searching. And I knew, in that moment, that he didn't believe me. But he didn't push. Not yet. Instead, he just nodded slowly, his jaw clenching. I see, he murmured. And somehow, that was worse. Because the tension in the air was suffocating. Because I knew this wasn't over. Because I knew the storm was coming. I thought I could keep my secret. I thought if I just played my part well enough, if I kept smiling, if I kept pretending, maybe everything would go back to the way it was. But secrets have a way of unraveling. Of slipping through the cracks when you least expect it. It started with the small things. The way my husband's touch lingered just a second longer, as if searching for something that was missing. The way his questions became more pointed, his tone a little too controlled, as if he was waiting for me to slip up. And then, the text. A single message that shattered my illusion of control. You left your bracelet in my car. Thought you might want it back. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. Because I wasn't alone. Because my husband was sitting right there. And because the message was still glowing on my unlocked phone screen. For a split second, I hesitated, frozen in sheer terror. Then I snatched the phone up, fumbling to lock it before he could see. But the shift in his expression told me everything. The suspicion. The knowing. I had just made my biggest mistake yet. I forced a smile, tucking my phone away like nothing had happened. But I could feel it. The ground crumbling beneath me. And I knew. It was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. That night, I barely spoke. I could feel his eyes on me as I moved through the house, as I cleaned up after dinner, as I climbed into bed beside him, my back turned, my breath shallow. And then, who is he? The question cut through the darkness. My entire body went rigid. I forced myself to stay still, to keep my breathing even. I don't know what you're talking about, I whispered. Silence. A long, suffocating silence. And then, a quiet chuckle. Not amused, not angry, just tired. I saw the message. My blood ran ice cold. I turned my head slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. He was watching me. Calm. Too calm. And that's when I knew. There was no lying my way out of this. He knew. And the confrontation had just begun. Silence stretched between us. The weight of it was unbearable. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my hands clenched into fists beneath the covers. My entire body was screaming at me to say something, do something, to deny, to deflect, to fight. But I couldn't, because the truth was staring me right in the face. I had been caught. And there was no taking it back. I sat up slowly, my throat dry, my mind spinning. I wanted to explain, to justify, to tell him that I had felt invisible, that I had felt unwanted, that for months, maybe even years, I had been drowning in a marriage that felt like a hollow shell of what it used to be. But what did that matter now? I had done something unforgivable, and no amount of loneliness could rewrite the reality of my choices. I inhaled shakily, forcing myself to meet his gaze. His eyes were unreadable, dark, not with anger, not yet, but with something else. Something that sent a sharp stab of guilt straight through me. Disappointment. I swallowed hard. I didn't mean. A bitter laugh. You didn't mean to? His voice was so quiet, yet it cut through me like a blade. I couldn't respond. Because what could I possibly say to that? I had meant to. Every text, every touch, every secret moment. I had chosen this. I had let myself fall into temptation, convincing myself it was harmless, telling myself that I deserved to feel wanted again, even if it meant betraying the man I had once promised forever to. And now I was sitting here, staring at the wreckage of my own making, wondering if it had ever really been worth it. That was the question echoing in my head. A question I didn't know how to answer. Because in the moment, it had felt like it. The thrill, the passion, the feeling of being seen again. It had felt intoxicating. Like waking up after years of feeling numb. But now all I felt was sick. Sick at the way he was looking at me. Sick at the thought of what I had thrown away. Sick at the realization that no amount of fleeting passion could ever outweigh the destruction I had just caused. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath hitching. I could still feel his hands on me. The other man. I had spent so much time chasing the feeling of being wanted that I hadn't stopped to think about what I was losing in the process. And now I had lost it all. I looked at my husband. Really looked at him. And for the first time in years, I realized something that shattered me. I still loved him. It wasn't the same love we had in the beginning. Not the kind of love that burned hot and fast, that made you breathless and reckless and stupid. No, it was something else. Something quieter, deeper. Something I had ignored for so long that I had convinced myself it no longer existed. But it was there. And now, I might have just destroyed it beyond repair. Tears burned the back of my throat, but I refused to let them fall. Because what right did I have to cry? What right did I have to mourn something I had shattered with my own hands? I had spent so long thinking I was the one who had been abandoned. That I was the one who had been neglected. But the truth was, I had been so caught up in my own loneliness, so consumed by my own need to feel wanted, that I had never stopped to consider what he had been feeling. Maybe he had been hurting too. Maybe he had been struggling in his own way, watching the distance grow between us and not knowing how to fix it. And now, maybe he never would. Because I had taken that choice away from him. Because I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And no matter how much I wished I could turn back time, I knew. I had no one to blame but myself. Loneliness is a dangerous thing. It creeps in quietly, slipping through the cracks of a life that once felt full. It whispers lies in your ear, telling you that you're forgotten, unwanted, invisible. And at first, you fight it. You tell yourself it's just a phase. That the distance, the cold silence, the nights spent lying awake beside someone who feels like a stranger, it's all normal. That marriages go through rough patches. That love changes. But then, one day, you stop fighting. Because the loneliness has worn you down, softened you, made you desperate for something, anything, that makes you feel alive again. And when that something, or rather someone, finally appears, you tell yourself it's harmless. That it's just a little attention. A little validation. A harmless conversation that lingers too long. A touch that sends shivers down your spine. A stolen moment where, for the first time in years, you matter to someone. But the truth is, it's never harmless. Because that's how it starts. Not with the betrayal itself, but with the justifications. I used to think I was a good person. A loyal wife. A devoted partner. Someone who believed in love, in commitment, in forever. I used to look at people who cheated and wonder how they could do it, how they could live with themselves. How they could look into the eyes of the person who trusted them the most and lie. I never thought I'd become one of them. I never thought I'd wake up one day and see a stranger staring back at me in the mirror. But that's exactly what happened. And the worst part? I can never take it back. Because there are some mistakes that don't come with second chances. Some choices that stain you forever. Some moments that haunt you, no matter how much time passes. And trust me, this is one of them. So if you're listening to this, if you've ever felt the kind of loneliness that pulls you towards something dangerous, be careful. Because what starts as a moment of comfort can quickly turn into something else. Something you can't undo. Something you can't forget. And one day, when the rush fades, when the excitement is gone, when all you're left with is the weight of your own choices, you'll realize the truth. That nothing, no stolen moment, no fleeting passion, no temporary escape, is worth the price of losing yourself. Because once you cross that line, once you break the heart of someone who trusted you, you will never be the same again.